You sit on the Senate Intelligence Committee. It has certainly been a committee that...
It's an oxymoron. Like military intelligence.
No comment. Anyhow, Marco Rubio last Friday tweeted out something. I want to read it here for you. He says, "I am now very confident the Senate Intel Committee will conduct a thorough bipartisan investigation of Putin influence and interference." Are you confident that the committee is doing what it needs to do in that respect?
Yes, absolutely. I've been confident from the very beginning. The Senate Intelligence Committee, like the Senate Armed Services Committee, is a very bipartisan committee. It does have as much prominence in the public eye as Armed Services Committee does because we meet primarily in a classified setting. But our hearings into the threat that Russia poses to the United States and Russian efforts to undermine American interests, to include the integrity of our electoral process, date far back before this month, before the election. They go back to the beginning of my time in the Senate and on the Intelligence Committee in early 2015. And Richard Burr, the Republican chairman, and Mark Warner, the Democratic vice chair, have both said publicly that they're committed to a thorough inquiry of all of Russia's malign activities, not just in the last 3 months, not just in the last year, but for many years going back. We've undertaken that inquiry already. We've had numerous hearings to date. Obviously, that's not happening in a public forum because this is some of the government's most sensitive classified information, but I can assure Arkansans that it is going very quickly, and we're going to follow the facts wherever they may lead us.
Where would you say we are in this investigation? Say if it was a football game, are we in the pregame warm-ups? Are we at halftime? Are we in the fourth quarter? Where do you kind of think the Intelligence Committee's work stands?
I'd say that we're certainly not in the warm-ups anymore, but we may be in the second quarter. You know, the most immediate thing that we wanted to focus upon was the report that the intelligence community made public in early January about Russian efforts in their assessment to hack into the email of the Democratic National Committee and into the campaign chairman of Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign. We're pretty far along in that process. We're reviewing documents. We're making an assessment. And as I've said publicly, I have no reason to doubt the intelligence community's assessment. But now we're opening our lens a little bit more broadly as we move forward, again, to focus on all of Russia's malign activities against the United States and our interests, especially in the integrity of our electoral process. But that predates, you know, last November. It's been going on for a long time. The techniques and the practices that the Russian government has used date back to the Soviet era.
President Trump has obviously been warm and fuzzy, as some would describe, towards Vladimir Putin. That has rubbed a lot of people wrong on both sides of the political aisle there. Do you think the president is naive about Russia?
No, I think this president, like the last three presidents, would like to have a stronger, more productive relationship with Russia. But Donald Trump, if he doesn't negotiate and deal with Vladimir Putin from a position of strength, will wind up in the same position that Bill Clinton and George Bush and Barack Obama did, which is playing Charlie Brown to Vladimir Putin's Lucy, kicking the football. I think Donald Trump appreciates that, and you know, whatever he said in an occasional interview or in a tweet, I would look at some of the actions he's taken, foremost among them the National Security Cabinet he's appointed just this week. He appointed H.R. McMaster as his National Security Advisor. I know General McMaster very well. He's legendary in the Army, and he's very much a Russia hawk. I'd also look at what some of those officials have said. Just in the last week, we've had Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis in Belgium, Vice President Pence in Germany, and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Joe Dunford in Azerbaijan, all taking very tough lines on Russia, saying there's no basis on which we could cooperate at this time.
You're going to get a lot of questions about health care reform, undoing, repealing, and replacing Obamacare. I think I have heard every potential scenario for what may happen: a quick repeal and replace, a not quick repeal and replace, a fix. We're going to scrap it. We're going to do. Where is your position on what needs to happen in this respect?
Well, I want to get health care reform right. I'm not as concerned about getting it fast, although this is a top priority of ours, and I expect we'll move forward with legislation sometime in the next 2 or 3 months at the minimum. But Obamacare has made our health care system worse. Before Obamacare, it had a lot of problems. It cost too much. Not enough people had access to health insurance, and health insurance didn't give the kind of coverage that people needed. Obamacare supposedly solved those problems. In reality, it's made those problems worse for a lot of people. So after we repeal Obamacare, I want to focus on solving those problems, on making health care affordable and personalized for everyone so they can make the right choices for themselves and their families.
Will health insurance companies go along with that, though? They need some certainty. They need something to be able to base their rates on. And if you're talking about repealing it with no replacement in sight, how do you do that?
Well, I think those two things need to happen as quickly as possible in conjunction with each other, repealing Obamacare and adopting new health care reforms that will actually serve the interest of working Arkansans. But there's a difference between the time in which we pass legislation and the time in which that legislation goes into effect. Obamacare was passed after 15 months of debate in 2010. It didn't go entirely into effect for another 3.5 years. So there will be at least some transition period so the market can adjust and we don't see the kind of chaos and disorder that happened in 2013 when Obamacare launched.
One of the trade-offs with the Affordable Care Act was Medicare took a cut, and that would go to the Medicaid expansion, which later became kind of a state option right there. Do you support the restoration of Medicare in terms of that, if Medicaid is going to get
Well,
pulled?
I don't like the kind of across-the-board draconian cuts that was imposed on Medicare providers, doctors, nurses, hospitals, and so forth. Some people say that's not a cut to the beneficiaries, but it really is, because if you're cutting how much we pay doctors to see Medicare beneficiaries, then they're going to be able to see fewer doctors. So I don't like those kind of cuts. Now, we need some reforms to Medicare. Medicaid ultimately is probably going to have to be a part of health care reform because it was so tied up with Obamacare. And what I would like to see on Medicaid expansion is much greater authority and discretion granted to our state governments. So our governor, our legislature can make the right decisions for Arkansans and the population that needs Medicaid in Arkansas, which is very different from who needs it in, say, California or Washington or Maine or Florida. So that I expect will be part of broader health care reform, which is cutting a lot of the red tape and the strings that are attached to that Medicaid money from Washington.
Last question to you on this subject, and we'll need to wrap up after this. Are you going to be a driver on this debate? I mean, you're on the Armed Services Committee, the Intelligence Committee. This is not really your wheelhouse in terms of committee assignment work, but it's a pretty big issue in terms of constituents. And
I expect to be very active in it. Obviously, for Arkansans, one of the biggest sources of day-to-day anxiety is the cost of health insurance. As premiums go up, as co-pays and deductibles go up, making those insurance premiums less valuable. And while I'm not on the committees that may be writing it, the Senate's a small place, and a lot of the work gets done in individual interactions, and we have a small majority, so we can't afford to sacrifice too many votes. So we have to work towards the interest of every individual senator, and I expect to be very involved in that and making sure that we get a solution that works for